Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Lewis at Large. Here's truly Warner Lewis here, of course, from the flight deck, and of course that means some smart talk radio is in your future, and this segment certainly no exception. An interesting topic indeed. Interrogation, clandestine operations, the Central Intelligence Agency, a world of post 9/11. What is that all about? Glenn Carle served 23 years in clandestine services of the CIA. He worked in a number of overseas posts on 4 different continents. He worked on terrorism issues. He has a new work out called The Interrogator and Education. It details his experience and views on the post 9/11 interrogation he conducted. It involves lots of very, very interesting stories and an interesting perspective indeed. We welcome him. Glenn, how are you, my friend?
I'm fine. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're very happy to have you here. We have talked about national security at times on this show. We've never talked to someone that has done it quite as directly as you have done. Let's do this. Let's give our Lewis at Large audience a little bit better setup. Specifically, give us the work that you did with CIA to the extent that you can, and what led you to writing the book.
Sure. Oh, well, that's a big question, which I'll have to try to answer shortly. I was a career clandestine services officer, as you said. That's the what an average person thinks of as being a spy. We're the guys that actually are the fun movies are made about. I lived overseas a good part of my career. That's what one does, and my job was to convince foreigners to spy for the United States. That was my career. I was not, and no one in the CIA was by profession really an interrogator. But after 9/11, when we started to have detainees, people we had picked up either in combat in Afghanistan or through our own clandestine operations, we had people who might have information that could stop another terrorist attack or help us understand what Al-Qaeda was like. And I was drawn into the interrogation of one of the top half dozen officers, we believed at the time, in Al-Qaeda itself. He was one of the prize catches. And so for several months I was involved and actually for a time led the field part of the interrogation of this person. I wrote my book, which is called The Interrogator, because I was as ardent and committed as anybody, of course, to trying to find Al-Qaeda and bin Laden and stopping him and other attacks. I had worked on terrorism for years prior to 9/11, and the agency had been very concerned about the threat from Al-Qaeda and from Islamically inspired terrorism. But that commitment to stopping the attack and protecting the country doesn't extend to breaking our own laws and torture, and I was very disturbed by what we were doing to ourselves, actually. So I wrote a book that describes how we really betrayed some of our ideals and need not have done so.
What, as you wrote this book, was there any kind of, I don't know whether it's professional or moral dilemma of, when I go down this path of writing a book, there's a very delicate balance between national security and yet giving the book enough sort of meat and detail and insight to make it sort of credible and sort of an interesting read. Tell us about that.
Oh, gosh. Well, that's a major part of sort of the sub-story in the large story about interrogation and enhanced interrogation and torture. Of course, I'm obliged, an obligation which I completely accept and understand, to protect sources and methods until my dying day. Anything that I write remotely about work that I did or national security, I must submit for clearance prior to publication. And I did that, and it took about almost 2 years, and I rewrote my book actually 12 times to meet the demands, which often I found exasperating, but the demands of the CIA to protect sources and methods. That's a legitimate concern. It's also not a cut and dry thing. Sometimes things are always gray rather than black and white, and what the agency might have thought or claimed was a source or method many other people think is simply protecting embarrassment. So it's a long negotiation, but I had to be very careful. And initially, the agency redacted, which means censored, 40% of the book, and then I spent 2 years working with them to write something that they would accept.
You worked everywhere. You were in Central America. You were in Europe. You were around the world. Were there over the course of your career? Was it because of the circumstances you were sent to? I'm sure hotbeds for certain reasons. Are there now officially hotbeds everywhere, and have there always been hotbeds everywhere?
Oh, well, yes. The world is always has its hair on fire. Hiking is one of my hobbies, and so I remember a number of years ago, I went on vacation. So I went up into the mountains, the White Mountains of New Hampshire, at that particular time, and vacation. And so I spent a week or 10 days cut off from everything except for the forest and the mountains. When I came out, I got a newspaper and started to look at what was going on. I thought, oh my God, the world's just completely collapsing and falling apart. And it was just terrible to see all the news. But it really was the same as always. Things are always in chaos. And Americans, it's hard to appreciate how amazingly safe and coherent lives we lead. Even those of us who have tough times, and many do. On the whole, ours is a government of laws that are designed to protect the individuals of our society, and it works remarkably well, and much of the world doesn't. So it's always been so, and I wouldn't say things are worse now than they've ever been. We have a different set of problems today than 20 years ago and 50 years ago, but this is why you have the CIA and the 82nd Airborne and the State Department, because someone has to pay attention to this stuff. But it's always been a dangerous world, certainly.
Yeah. Here's a question I've got for you. I've asked this of a couple of other guests that have been involved in the intelligence gathering community. How in the world do the American intelligence agencies coordinate their efforts with those in Europe or those in Asia or those in South America somewhere? How is everybody out sort of doing their own thing, or at what point does there need to be, and should there be, and is there collaboration? Because it's got to be so incredibly complicated, I would think.
Oh, there's intimate cooperation among most intelligence services in the world. Now, you always have to say at the same time that no country has any friends. No, even your allies are not really your friends. They're your friends if their interests and yours coincide or overlap. But all countries act in their own interest. That's not a bad thing. That just is how it is. So at the same time that the United States or France or Russia or Zimbabwe are pursuing their interests that might clash with those of the other states I just mentioned, you might work together too. An example of this would be the United States and Russia, for example, which are, of course, longstanding rivals, and we are not the greatest of friends with respect to Syria. Now, we are not, we don't agree on much about what should happen in Syria. Nonetheless, at the same time, the United States and Russia will work together on any number of counterterrorism issues because the Russians don't want to have parts of Moscow blow up, and we don't want to have parts of New York blow up, and so you work together. It's not just daily. People will from different services in different countries will be working together all day, every day. It's very, very intimate and cooperative, and that was the case prior to 9/11, and of course since 9/11. All the time, I worked a lot with foreign intelligence services.
Yep. Again, if you've just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis, from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. In this segment, we're talking specifically about intelligence gathering. We're talking to a guy that knows it quite well, Glenn Carle. He spent 23 years in the clandestine services area of the CIA, also has done a variety of other intelligence work as well as interrogation, including penning a brand new work called The Interrogator, an education. It details his experience and views on the post 9/11 interrogation he's conducted. Glenn, you're not. This isn't traditional warfare. This is not the world where Glenn Carle did not spend his career tracking the movement of troops. You were tracking many times, I'm sure, individuals or a small group of individuals and trying to figure out, climbing inside their mindset, what were they planning, all these various kinds of things, and many times probably matching wits with people that had a lot of the same intelligence, or not the intelligence, but the means of communication that you did. And I'm curious as to, in light of the Paris shootings and what is currently being considered, I'm sure, a very, very tenuous situation right now in Europe and particularly London, the threats that are there, are those, just looking from afar, were those threats have been known for a long, long time, or are those things just brand new intelligence gathering that suddenly broke something open?
Well, this is part of the tragedy, is that these are well-known problems. The individuals themselves were known to the French and known to the Americans, and the French had actually jailed, I think, at least 2 of the 3 for terrorist-related activities in the past. So they were not surprises, nor is the kind of threat that they posed, and which I can talk about because it's an important issue, nor was the kind of threat they posed a surprise, or the larger issue of terrorism inspired by perverse interpretations of Islam a surprise. The terrible problem is for the French and for the Americans and for the Dutch before them and for the British and for the Spanish, just to cite a number of terrible terrorist attacks that succeeded in the last decade. The problem is to know when certain individuals are going to actually commit an act. It's hard to, if we knew that, then there would be no terrorist acts that occur almost. The French knew these men. There was a prominent Dutchman named Theo van Gogh who was murdered by a terrorist who had a similar profile to the men in Paris. That was a few years ago. The Dutch knew who they were. The Spanish knew who the perpetrators of the Madrid train bombings were, and the British knew who the perpetrators of the London bombings about 7 years ago were. But a free society, a society of law, can't indefinitely detain someone who has not committed a crime. If you can associate these people with people who have broken the law, and you know that they are plotting, not just that they are someone you have to watch out for, then you can stop them. But in each of those cases, that wasn't the circumstance. So it's a terrible problem for law enforcement authorities, for the governments, and for intelligence agencies. Even when we know who bad guys might be, you can't simply take somebody down who has not yet done anything. You have to have probable cause, and you have to have warrants, and there's the whole rule of law, which protects all of us, actually, but it makes the job of stopping a terrorist attack hard.
Let me jump back to 9/11 here and ask you sort of I'm not feeling philosophical. It's not designed, by the way, at all in any way, shape, or form to be political. As an intellectual exercise, based on what you know, and again with the incredible benefit of 20/20 hindsight, should American intelligence been able to postulate and formulate there will in fact be an attack of some kind using airliners and driving them into well-known American landmarks? Is that something we should have known or did know, didn't act on? And do you have a strong opinion about that one way or the other?
Yeah, well, it is a fact that, although it's little known, that I think it was in the 18 months prior to the attacks of 9/11, the CIA this is an actual number, sent 47 separate warnings based on intelligence to the Federal Aviation Administration about threats to American aviation by terrorists. Now, we didn't know that the permutation that they would take, the Al-Qaeda would take, of using planes as suicide bombs. So, in a sense, we didn't know that. You could say we got that wrong. But the threat to aviation, we certainly knew. Now, in the FAA's defense, their response essentially was, well, okay, so there is a general threat, but where, when, how, what, and what are we supposed to do about it? In the absence of that, to say, bad guys are coming, didn't help them a whole lot. So you can say both statements are true, that we had warned and were conscious of the threat, and we didn't get it right. And both statements are simultaneously true, which is not very satisfying at all, because the job is to stop these kinds of things.
Right.
This is it's human ingenuity will always come up with little permutations that you don't think that someone thinks of first, and you cannot foresee all changes of tactics. So you just have to, which is not, that's not an acceptable answer. You have to be perfect in counterterrorism, otherwise people will die, and no human has yet managed to be perfect, tragically.
Your last position was the Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Transnational Threats on the National Intelligence Council. That must have been a hell of a business card you had with a title like that.
It's pretty long. The agency, I always used to make jokes when I started to talk that if I had been in the military, I could have said, hello, ladies and gentlemen, I'm the G2 or the J2 for such and such an command.
Right.
And that means I'm the intelligence guy. It's done. But there's this long-winded, endless sentence that gives me my title. But the Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Transnational Threats means that I was in the intelligence community at the summit of the intelligence community since the 17 agencies reported to the National Intelligence Council, where I worked, which is very, very small, only 12 senior officers and then about 20 deputies. And they provide their assessments on whatever the question is. What will Al-Qaeda do next? What kind of weapons will they use? Where will they go, say? And then the office I was in comes up with the formal position of the intelligence community and reports that to the president or to a combatant commander in the field. So it was the privilege of a lifetime to serve there,
right.
And also in a way an impossible job because we're about the only ones in the government who are supposed to have a crystal ball, and no one has a crystal ball, unfortunately.
How responsive do you feel? When you would report to the president, you would report to various committees, public or otherwise, in Congress? Did you get a sympathetic and responsive ear? And if you did not, I'm curious as to, was there any relationship between, again, the parties that were in power at the time or not? Was there any patterns there at all? Or just tell us about that from the political side.
Yeah, well, that's a difficult and exceptionally important and delicate question. The job of the CIA, I was a career CIA officer, of course, is in the phrase "to speak truth to power." So we're supposed to say that the emperor has no clothes, or that what he's doing it doesn't fit the facts. We don't make policy. The intelligence community does not say, "Mr. President, you should do this or do that." It says, "Here's what we believe is happening, what we believe will happen." And then when asked, we might say, well, here's what we think the consequences will be of various possible actions. So we aren't supposed to ever say policy recommendation. That's for the State Department to do. But politics is very important, and no leader, be he Democrat or Republican or anything, wants to be told something that doesn't fit his or her views. So speaking truth to power is a dangerous responsibility and function. And often if you say things that leaders don't like, they will ignore it, or they will find someone who says something that they do like. And frequently, after 9/11, the intelligence community said things that our political leaders didn't really want to hear, and that they thought, therefore, were disloyal, which is not the case at all. That is our job, to say things not because they are popular, but because we think that they're true. So there was frequent friction between the intelligence community, the State Department, and the executive branch, definitely.
Again, we're with Glenn Carle, author of The Interrogator and Education. It's a book detailing his experiences and views on the post-9/11 interrogations he conducted, as well as his work, 23 years in clandestine services of the CIA and on a variety of national intelligence work that he has done. Glenn, let's move forward kind of to the present a little bit. Look around the international community. Do you believe at this particular point that the American intelligence agencies and resources have the freedom and the resources they need anyway to conduct at least credible investigations and to do their work, or do you feel like we're running uphill here?
Yeah, that's another very important question. And the short answer is yes, the intelligence agencies, the military, the State Department, State Department less so because they don't have much money, but that's another issue, do have the abilities, the resources, and the knowledge and how to conduct their business, and can do so. I would argue, and I'm in no way am I a Pollyanna, and I'm certainly not hostile to the CIA intelligence actions or unilateral actions by the United States. I mean, that's what I spent my life devoted to trying to do successfully, and I certainly accept the importance of the United States being able to act to protect our citizens and our national interests. But that said, the concern, I think, actually is that we have, out of fear, compromised in ways that are dangerous to ourselves some of the protections that we've worked centuries to develop, protections of what it is to be an American, of our individual rights. I serve the government. I was part of the government, and the government tries to serve the people. But unless the government is constrained by our laws, then our freedoms are in danger. And we have, out of fear, sometimes strayed past where we are supposed to go legally and morally, and unnecessarily so. And the specific example, of course, that so dominated my life for a number of years now has been the issue, frankly, of enhanced interrogation. Of course, you want to get the information you need to get to protect American citizens' lives and treasure. But you don't do so by compromising the Constitution and therefore betraying the principles that we're supposed to be defending. And we did. You don't need to do that. Being tough, being hard, and getting the information you need is all sounds, well, yes, of course. You do that in a time of crisis, but you can do that while being smart and being principled and not playing loose with the interpretation of the law. And there we made some tragic mistakes.
Were you ever in a situation where you had those very difficult sort of moral and ethical choices during interrogations?
Absolutely. When I was brought in to become involved in the interrogation of this fellow whom we believe was one of the top half dozen officers, you can call him, in Al-Qaeda, I was told, and this is a direct quote, I was said, and I had been brought into this program, we essentially had been following this man for years and kidnapped him because we thought that he could lead us to bin Laden. This is within less than a year after 9/11. We were determined to get bin Laden and take down Al-Qaeda. Absolutely, we should. So we decided to act, and we snatched this guy, and then I was told, quote, you will do whatever it takes to get this man to talk. Do you understand? And I certainly understood, but I was astounded because my word-for-word response was, well, we don't do that. And the answer was, well, we do now. And I said, well, we need at least a direct presidential order to do something like that. and I was told that we had it. And then my thought was, and this was all in real time, instantaneous. This is not hindsight on my part. This is how I thought and reacted at the time. It was just obvious to me. I frankly thought, the president doesn't get to do that. I don't care if the president says you have to do this. The president can only act within the law, too. No one. That's the triumph of our government, is that no one is above the law, even if you were the president. The Constitution is supreme, not the president. And so then I said, well, suppose something happens that I consider unacceptable. And then the answer was, well, if you don't like what's happening, you walk out of the room, and you won't have seen it, and so nothing will have happened, will it? And I thought that was crazy. I couldn't believe that American officials, CIA officers, were talking in this way. And so I said, well, what about the Geneva Convention, which, by the way, very important to know, the United States wrote. We wrote the Geneva Convention because it embodies our laws. And then what about the Convention Against Torture? What about the U.S. Constitution, which makes it illegal to engage in cruel and unusual punishment? And the answer was, to me, well, which flag do you serve? And I thought that was a frankly disgusting response, challenging my patriotism when I was raising issues of constitutional obligation and moral and legal obligation, and how you are an effective and honorable officer. And that's what we did to ourselves. So yes, these issues came up right away.
Do you believe that doing it legally, so to speak, and within the proper moral and ethical bounds, we are in fact able to ascertain the kind of information we need to wage an effective war? Again, this loose term, war on terror, but again, get the kind of intelligence we need.
Yeah, I don't just believe it; I know it. I mean, there are an infinite number of documented and objective measures of what makes an effective interrogation and which interrogations have worked and which don't. And coercive methods do not provide good intelligence consistently. Will they ever provide some information that may be of some use? Surely the answer is yes. Even a broken clock is right twice a day, as we all know. But that forgets the important part of the entire process, which is that you don't know what is good or bad when someone says it to you. Part of being an intelligence officer's responsibility is you have to try to verify the information, find out what is reliable or not. And what you do know is that information obtained under coercion is exponentially more likely to be untrustworthy. And then there are any number of objective studies that show that the way you obtain intelligence successfully, information, the way you interrogate successfully, is through establishing a human rapport. It's fundamentally a human activity. It's not one of power where you put your heel on someone's neck or break his arm or so terrify him that he will say anything to stop the pain or end the fear. And that's what happens when you use coercive measures. This is not just my assertion. This is simply known by people who are professional interrogators, which I am not. The FBI knows what it's doing, and not only for legal reasons, but for practical ones, vehemently rejects using that sort of thing. And as do any number of studies show, this just doesn't work.
Well, boy, we could go on quite a while here, but do need to wind this down. One final question here for you, and this is pretty global, but I would like to get your opinion. You've been in this work for a long, long time. You've been out of it now enough to sort of maybe separate yourself from it a little bit. But from what you see overall, are you hopeful that the intelligence communities and what's happening in the world, and again, this loose term of war on terror, is the world becoming a more safe place, do you believe, or are we in for a rough ride?
Well, both statements are true in the very largest sense. In my lifetime, I was born shortly after World War. I'm a baby boomer, so I was born after World War II. In our lifetimes, the world has become a dramatically better place for all of the reasons that are important to Americans. Individual rights are up. Health is up. The safety of individuals, despite our fear and focus on terrorism, is up. The number of people dying from violence of all sorts, not accidents, I'm talking intentionally perpetrated acts of violence, is down globally. Even all of this terrorist stuff, which is bad and which is terrible, and that the CIA and the FBI and other relevant party agencies should be vigorously working to stop, which of course they have been and continue to be. Even the incidence of terrorism in the global sense is the long-term trend is down. But there are a whole bunch of reasons for this, largely through the development of societies, which is the success of American policies in globally in some ways. That said, for the rest of your life, I don't know how old you are, but for the rest of your life, whatever it will be and the rest of mine, we will have to deal with continuing acts of terrorism like we saw in Paris a few days ago, like we experienced in New York. This will continue to happen. The Islamic world is in revolution. It's struggling. 1.2 billion people are struggling to reconcile their religion and their cultures with globalization in the modern world, and this is going to cause some small percentage of those societies to act out violently against what they think is causing all of the harm to their traditional ways of life, and that's the West. And we'll have to deal with this for the rest of our days, yes.
Well, it is a fascinating subject of which we are all extremely interested and have a very big stake in all of this. The work is called The Interrogator, an Education by Glenn Carle, a longtime intelligence officer serving the United States of America. Glenn, how can people find out more about the work you do and the book?
Well, I do have a website which I need to update, but on the website there are some things about some interviews that I've given and links to the book. One can buy the book at Amazon, online, and Barnes and Noble, and Libris, and directly from Nation Books where it was published. And I try to speak to whomever will want to listen to me. And the book has been. This will sound very self-serving, and so I suppose I shouldn't say it, but the book was reviewed as the greatest nonfiction book written about the CIA ever, which of course makes me very proud. And whether that's true or not, it does describe, to the best of my ability anyway, an important and difficult program that the U.S. is engaged in that I think has in some ways caused us more harm than good. But it's an important one for Americans to know about.
Well, thank you so much for your service to the country, and also thank you for spending time with us today. I appreciate it quite a bit. Would love to have you back on again sometime.
Anytime. You're very kind. Thank you.
You bet. We'll be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.